Hey, gang. I had a conversation with Daniel Bessner, who is a professor at the University of Washington, about his recent cover story in Harper's magazine about the end of the American century, although we discussed a lot of other stuff as well. If you want to help Culturally Determined succeed, one way to do so is to leave a 5-star rating and or a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this show. Thanks. Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Daniel Bessner. Daniel, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Daniel Bessner. I am the co-host of the American Prestige podcast.
Thanks for coming back on the show. I think you're officially a friend of the pod at this point.
Yeah, I've been on a bunch.
Yeah, I think 6 times. I did a little count before we got on. So this is lucky
Nice.
number 7. And so thank you for coming back on. And we're going to be talking about your cover story, an essay in last month's Harper's, the July issue, which people can probably still find on the newsstands if they want the print, or it's online as well. The headline on the cover is "The American Century is Over, What's Next?" And Empire Burlesque is the title for the essay itself. Well, congratulations on a cover article in Harper's. That's a big deal. How did this piece come together, and why did you want to write it?
Well, a friend of mine put me in contact with the editor of Harper's because he writes for Harper's relatively regularly. And I basically pitched them a piece that would be kind of my version of a George Kennan, like big grand strategic thinking piece from the perspective of 2022. And so I pitched the piece as kind of reading where DC is on the US-China relationship, because I think that's the big thing that people there are focused on. So I read a bunch of reports from a variety of think tanks, the major think tanks in DC, and also some newer ones, and framed this debates rather between so-called liberal internationalists and restrainers. And then I wrote the piece, and the rest is history.
So you're doing George Kennan. So this is like, Article X, whatever that thing was called. Communique 47. What was that thing called that you wrote that was very influential?
So there's the long telegram of February 46, which is his actual report from from within the government, and then he does sort of a more popular, streamlined version in Foreign Affairs under the name X.
Okay, so that's dramatic. So yours is a little less dramatic because you're not a government employee. You are a professor, podcaster, public intellectual. Okay, so your piece is very much a counter narrative to the prevailing foreign policy narrative. What do you think, sort of the mainstream or the blob, as some people call it, the foreign policy blob? What do you think they're wrong about?
Well, I mean, they basically just want the United States to rule the world now and forever. And I think that has a bunch of issues with it. I think it has philosophical issues. The premise is wrong. I think it has empirical issues that the United States can't really do what it wants to do. And I think it has normative issues in suggesting what type of foreign policy the United States should pursue. But basically, to make it in this meritocracy, quote unquote, that we have, in DC in particular, you've got to basically believe the United States should govern the world now and forever. And that's still the de facto position of people in this world.
Okay, so the piece is about American hegemony and the decline of American hegemony, and whether that is, I guess, inevitable, something to be mourned, something that we have to deal with either way. And so, I guess the average like DC foreign policy think tank person thinks that it's a good thing that America has been the global hegemon since 1945. Do you disagree with that?
Sorry, do I disagree with that it has been a good thing, or that they agree with that position?
Well, either one. I meant more. Do you disagree that it's a good thing? But am I wrong in
not
thinking?
A good thing.
Am I wrong in thinking that that's the average?
Yeah, for sure.
View?
Yeah, I think that's right. That is the average. I mean, because most people who go into this come from a particular class, the people who have succeeded in the system. So they think the system is good. What shock. But yeah, I think that's wrong.
Okay, what's the counter narrative?
That the United States has done an enormous amount of damage to the world, and I go through that, the various coups in the global South. I would say basically helping global capitalism become hegemonic, particularly a consumer-centered capitalism that relies on constantly consuming the world's raw materials wasn't an especially good thing for the earth, or, to say nothing of the shattering of communal bonds and things that this neoliberal consumer figure, contributes to. And I would say, broadly speaking, to put it at its most general level, it might have been good for Western and Central Europe, and ending wars, so you don't get another world war in on the continent of Europe, and you're able to consume quite a bit if you're under the American nuclear umbrella there. But for most of the global South, the American century, quote unquote, was pretty shitty. So that's my basic take on that whole issue.
Okay, so the term American century was either coined or at least popularized by Henry Luce, who was the founder of Time and Life magazines. Is that right?
Yeah, he was like a major publisher. I don't know if he was the literal founder.
Okay.
He published them though for sure.
Okay. Yeah, I think he was the. I think he. Well, at least Time. I think he was the founder, and he had a story in 1941 coining this term the American century, and basically arguing that the absence of American leadership after the disasters of World War One like set things up for what was happening in Europe right then, and he was urging America to take a leadership role on the global stage. And this is, and Pearl Harbor happened 10 months later, and America entered the war. So, well, he was prescient, I guess, in some ways. Were there still people in 1941 thinking America could just stay out of this thing and it would
Sure, yeah.
it would end in some way or another?
America was already effectively doing quite a bit for the war in terms of lend-lease and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. But yeah, no, there absolutely were. I mean, really, until World War II, one of the strongest traditions in U.S. foreign policy was stay out of Europe. So that was still, it doesn't disappear overnight. The U.S. establishment, I think, makes the choice for global hegemony in the summer of 1940 after the fall of France. Stephen Wertheim wrote about that in his book, Tomorrow the World. But no, absolutely, there are still people who want the United States to remain aloof from, especially European affairs. I mean, the isolationist is not a correct term, because basically everyone thought the U.S. should dominate the Western Hemisphere. So unless you totally get rid of the Western Hemisphere, there's no such thing as isolation. It really related to how far and how deep the U.S. should go into Europe and East Asia.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, don't use isolationist. It's not a real word. It's not. It doesn't describe a real philosophy.
Okay, you mean even the people
America
who,
Firtzers
who we,
wanted
who
to.
we call today isolationists from the 1930s still wanted America to be the hegemon in South and Central America?
Yeah, unless you think that those areas of the world don't count. There were no isolationists.
Okay, so Charles Lindbergh was not shedding tears for whatever was happening in Haiti and Cuba and the Dominican Republic.
I don't know
He
the thought of Charles Lindbergh enough, but in general, people who adopted like don't get involved in World War II were quite fine with U.S. domination and dollar diplomacy and things like that in Central and South
Okay,
America and
and
the
I mean this,
Caribbean.
this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, which was like 1820 or something, right? That America would was claiming hegemony over the hemisphere.
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine, and I think it's announced formally in 1823. But yeah, it's a long-standing tradition. Yeah,
And and to this day, we assume that we're the the U.S.
yeah,
is the
for sure.
hegemon in our hemisphere. Okay, so is there a counterfactual where, and I'm sure there are like not alternate history novels written about this, where Germany does not declare war on the United States days after Pearl Harbor, and America just fights some sort of battle against Japan and comes comes like a separate peace with Europe? What was this
I mean, that was
inevitable?
a consideration, but pretty early on, by 40, 41, most people in the establishment think that's not really possible. That Germany is going to have expansionist ambitions, but even more than that, like it represented the triumph of fascism, and so that was like a real challenge to what Americans envisioned themselves as doing. So it was two like actually different ideologies, like a real fascism tied to a real state that was seemingly quite powerful, was quite powerful.
So at the end of World War II, America is the great power left standing. And well, let me read two quotes from your piece. You write, so there's this idea that, the Cold War, wasn't that bad for America because, there weren't any direct conflicts. The proxy wars were, compared to the other wars of the 20th century, not so bad. So you write,
Well, not so bad for Americans, pretty brutal for everyone else. Yeah.
So you write, Cold War was hardly the quote long peace that many liberal internationalists valorize. It was rather incredibly violent. The historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain estimates that at least 20 million people died in Cold War conflicts, the equivalent of 1,200 deaths a day for 45 years. I think you mentioned this in other podcasts I've heard you, where you talk about the Cold War with someone saying, well, isn't it good that America won the Cold War? That there's this, toll that the average American doesn't think about, because it didn't happen here. So, and it was
So who cares about
mostly
other
developing
humans?
world countries. And yeah, it was proxy wars. Okay, but at the same time, there wasn't great power conflict during.
Well, I mean, then this gets into the consumer capitalism thing, which I think is just like bar none horrible for humanity. I think it's spiritually bad. I think it's environmentally bad, and that's what really the United States gave to the world.
You mean like
Yeah,
by
consuming. Like, think about how much we consume. Like,
yes.
literally just destroying the earth through raw material consumption and the purchasing of consumer products that make us all sad.
Oh, what is the connection you see to
And
our?
that was totally dependent on American Empire. Yeah, I mean, this is totally American Empire. Think about a city like LA, which is a city based on what? Driving. What is that based on? Having access to rubber and oil. Things like that. These things are inextricably connected, to say nothing of the military Keynesianism that defines so much of the post-war political economy. That the only way we get social democratic benefits in this country is through military spending. It just perverted everything. Like, it just like it made everything that could have been good. Instead of using technology for human ends, we used it for militarist bad ends.
Right. And maybe this is what military Keynesianism means, but America spends more on military, everything than most of the rest of the
Yeah,
world combined.
discretionary spending. Yeah, yeah.
And it's sort of like our version of a command economy and social safety net
Yep.
is, and an industrial policy, because we make our own tanks and bombs and stuff. It's just like in other Western countries, these things are not directed primarily through the military, but America has like its own version of the NHS, which is healthcare for service members and veterans, and yeah, an industrial policy for building fighter jets and tanks and stuff. So that was a choice that was made. I don't know if, I mean, what's the alternate path to a general consumerist society? That, from my
I
perspective,
mean,
that seems
don't
hard to avoid.
why do you think it's overdetermined? Let me throw the question back to you. People can make different choices about what they do in the world. You don't have to let the fetishistic consumer objects control you. You don't have to make what
but
it
but there's
means
so
to be an
much but
American to
there's
be
so much
consuming
fun.
stuff.
Like
Are they?
well, who's letting? So the a different government would have prevented all these fun little electronic toys we have from ever being developed or sold. So these are like too dangerous
I mean,
for you to have.
there was an ideology of modernization that this meant progress, and that was inextricably tied to the idea of the American Empire. And I don't think that necessarily had to be the case. It's what occurred historically. But I don't think that consumer capitalism was, the end point of humanity, or the end point of even American capitalism. If you don't get perhaps the Red Scare and the Lavender Scares of the late 40s and early 50s, maybe you have an actual not demolished left wing in this country that could propose alternative ways of living, as opposed to just buying things and then feeling pretty shitty about yourself at the end of it, I think.
Well, this sounds like sort of like the new left argument about like the emptiness of modern life, like that young
I mean, the
people
new
were
left all
realizing
bought
in the
into it.
60s.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how heavy of a new left argument that really was. I'm pretty skeptical of the new left, but they brought in pretty quickly to consumer capitalism.
Right, because it is very appealing. But, I don't know if it's materially determined exactly, but what countries do you look at as a model for what American
What
hegemony
country was an
could
American
have provided as an alternate, lifestyle right now?
I mean, like just because something hasn't existed yet in history doesn't mean that it wasn't possible. There's also been no country that's been nearly as powerful as the United States in history. Questions like that I always find kind of silly. It's like it's like the classic liberal response. It's like, I want the 40-step plan to how we get to where you are. Or I want the exact example in history, which underlying that is a theory of human nature, which I think is silly, which is that human beings are necessarily going to do things like consume. And I mean, I just don't think human nature is that knowable, and it's so profoundly shaped by culture that you could have a multiplicity of different alternatives. But there were like different ideologies in various spaces over the course of the 19th and early 20th century. There were experiments and things like this in places like Cuba and other socialist countries that didn't work out, partially because of their own internal problems, partially because of the American empire. But I mean, it just doesn't seem like this is inevitable. I mean, because nothing's really inevitable. That's just not how history works. It's contingent, and there are human agents who shape what's going on.
Okay, well, I agree with you about contingency, but at the same time, as I'm a disciple of using a term with somewhat of a joking tone of Robert Wright, author of The Moral Animal, which is about what arguing there is a human nature because of the evolution of
Yeah, I mean, I think that
humans. So you reject that sort of thinking?
do I reject evolutionary psychology? Do I think men cheat because of something in the primitive environment 30,000 years ago?
Well, why do you think men
Basically,
cheat?
the classic argument. Well, I would say this. I would say clearly human beings have some material aspects, and like clearly that there's been a material effect on human action. But I would just say like culture is so much more important than any material things that human beings have. I guess I fundamentally reject the principle that you could make a claim that men cheat because of evolution of the mind. And I also think like
What's one alternate reason men cheat would
culture.
be that they're they're being tempted
Well,
by
women cheat
the
too. I
the
mean,
wickedness inherent in
these are
sinful
also
humans. That's
there
one
are.
possible belief. I don't agree with that one. You
Well, I
should
would
talk to
say,
Bob because I'm parroting his
yeah, no, I'd be happy to talk about. I mean, I would just say
his line here.
look at all the psychological studies. I
But
mean, I that
I
have
don't
been
know. I'm
proven
very skeptical
incorrect.
of any attempts to create a new man kind of thing. Well,
Sure,
as a
because
historian,
the
you're
weight of
saying that
history.
the current existing models are are not every possible model. But the ones we've had so far haven't, mostly turned to disaster or are just
What are you
fizzled
referring
away.
to?
New Soviet man, new National Socialist man, people
Sure.
are sort of always act the same. That's the reason we still read Shakespeare
Why do you think
and
the Soviet
recognize.
Union failed? Why do you think the Soviet Union failed?
I
I
mean,
mean,
I think there are a lot
you'd
of
have to go
reasons.
through the history, but so it's 1924.
Russia's a really fucked
Lenin
up
dies.
country that keeps on making poor decisions. Over the 20th century and 21st would be
Unlike the
one reason.
United States.
Well,
I mean,
we've made plenty, but the system hasn't collapsed yet. Although it's teetering. Yeah, but the idea that the internal contradictions of of communism, of Soviet communism, were stronger than the internal contradictions of capitalism, such that one empire collapsed and one empire became the hegemon. Right?
sure. I mean, I think the United States was starting at just like a different level of development, different level of capacity. Wasn't destroyed by World War II at all. I think there are a lot of contingencies in there, to say nothing about like Stalin and what Stalin did and people along those lines. But yeah, I mean, sure, there hasn't been a utopian society. I mean, but I don't know, that sort of claim is always like, then you could say liberal constitutional capitalism has failed. Look at Roe v. Wade and mass incarceration and immiseration in this country and inequality. I would say we've never reached that for any political system.
Well, this is a tragic view of human history, possibly. Although I guess you're holding out hope for a different system. But okay, we sort of ended up in a cul-de-sac here. But one,
I mean, just one thing, not to excuse the many crimes of the socialist world or the Soviet Union, but it's just that to me that doesn't indicate that we shouldn't, try elements of socialism. It's just like it's a non sequitur.
well, okay. My general view on utopian people, utopian thinking, is that these are dangerous people. Envisioning a
So
perfect.
who's not dangerous?
Well, let me
Cass
just.
Sunstein,
Well, he wants to nudge people. Certainly,
which has just been proven to be
nudging could
bullshit.
be. There are things worse than nudging.
But did you see that study that just came out that just showed it was total nonsense? Liberals are utopians too, is my point. Real
I don't
utopians.
think they are. I mean,
The market's a utopian creation. Absolutely.
well,
Liberals
maybe
even say
maybe
this.
a libertarian purist would think that the
No,
market's
liberals in the
the
19th,
market
20th century say
is a
that. That's their
utopia.
utopia. The market's their utopia. That's the hand decider. It's God. Literally, it's the God. It's as utopian as socialism, certainly. Certainly.
Oh, I disagree with that. But you're
Yeah, you
as
were
a
raised in the system. Of course you do.
historian of American policy, I guess you're gonna win that debate. But the idea that the perfect society is just over the next hill, and there's certain things we have to do right now to get there. And if you think that it's a utopia of eternal bliss and greatness, then you'll do anything to get there. And those things include, liquidating the kulaks and, and various other, and killing a bunch of people. Um,
Genociding the Native Americans.
yeah, I don't think well, you could say that the colonists saw
I wouldn't
America
excuse that one,
as a new
Aryeh. I
Jerusalem.
would accept that one. Slavery, chattel slavery.
Okay. The excerpt I read before about 20 million people being killed in Cold War conflicts, 1,200 a day. A couple sentences later, when you're talking about America, the undisputed hegemon after 1945, you say its closest competitor was a crippled Soviet Union struggling to recover from the loss of more than 20 million citizens and the devastation of significant amounts of its territory. So, can we at least say that the Cold War period with America sort of as a hegemon, fewer people died because 20 million died in 6 years in one country?
Well, then the question is, why is it necessary to have American hegemony for that? Was there going to be another World War III on the European continent unless the America put tons of bases in Western Germany? I don't think so. I think we actually know that now
Well,
from
it's
looking at the
possible to
Soviet
say
archives.
that it was just nuclear bombs, the existence of nuclear bombs and mutually assured destruction that prevented another world war. Is
Or
that
the fact that the Soviet Union didn't have the fantasy of dominating the world, which as its archives show.
okay? This is an argument
That's an
I've heard
American
you make before,
fantasy.
and you've made it more thoroughly in conversations with Glenn Lowry that I've listened to. And I mean, it's an interesting one. It seemed like both the American ideology and the communist ideology had totalizing, like,
Yeah, I
universalist
don't think that's right.
claims.
I don't think I don't think that is right, broadly speaking, I guess, but I think in practice the Americans took it way further than the Soviets, just like they're taking it way further than the Chinese government today.
Well, I mean, both countries had global ambitions in that they were supporting various groups and
Scale's
supporting
totally
or
different.
not supporting governments around the world
Scale's different.
in terms of what
The
America did
Americans did a
versus what
lot
the
more.
Soviets did.
Yeah,
Well, we
and way more
won.
regions of the
So what?
world.
So one
No, but even in
one
the
leads to the
50s and
other.
60s.
Like that, they were much more constrained than we were in terms of resources,
Yeah,
and people were generally
exactly.
fleeing from there towards the west, though, for someone in the other direction. Um, but my point about, okay, 20 million people died in the Soviet Union during World War II, 80 million or so killed during those 6 years, and then you have 1945 to 1989, 20 million total. Of course, horrible, and more people that have ever been killed in wars in American history, I assume. Um, but still better than second,
Sure, but
World War
that's not the
Three.
comparison. The comparison isn't to World War One and World War Two. It's, do you need to get did you need the benefits of the post 1945 period? Is that dependent upon the American empire? I don't see how.
Okay.
That's the claim. It's not like this is better than something horrible. It's the counterfactual of how is this did you need the American empire for it? I don't see how.
Well, I guess there's no way. How do historians argue counterfactuals? There's we can only run this thing once.
Yeah, I mean it's very careful logical reasoning about what are the benefits of the action and what are not the benefits. But I mean, I just don't see, from even a common sense perspective, why did you need the United States going around the world toppling socialist governments?
It seems like largely a waste of time, effort, money, and human lives, given that the Soviet Union collapsed without a direct war. So, because their system sort of was messed up and didn't really work, or was weaker than the capitalist system, these things would have collapsed under their own weight, more or less.
Just a question. Do you think the American system works?
I mean, it works better than the Soviet system.
So the criterion
I
is
would
just
say
not
that.
collapsing?
Well, if we're looking at empires over time, they all eventually rise and fall. You're arguing that ours has ended. The American empire has ended, whether we
Or on the
people, our
verge, or
elected
something will
representatives,
change?
realize it or not.
Yeah, something's changed. Whether it's ended or not, I don't know. The American century is not the American, is not equivalent to the American empire. The American century is like the larger ideological project, and what Americans believed in, and their capacity to change the world, all that stuff.
Okay, so there's a word and then a two-word phrase that are not mentioned in your essay. The word is the Holocaust, and the two-word phrase is United Nations. Why are those? Why is neither of those things mentioned in your essay?
Why should they be mentioned? Make the argument why they should be mentioned.
Okay, Holocaust. The liberal internationalist effort is in some ways spurred by the never again ethos, and
That's not true.
and
That's
maybe
not
you
historically
think that
accurate.
is pure balderdash that
No, that's not true. I
we
mean,
tell
it's just not
ourselves.
true. If you go
Um,
back to the documents, that's just not accurate.
well,
I
I
mean,
mean,
it's
in
just not true.
1947, people didn't care a lot about the Holocaust, but
Exactly.
but preventing another world war in which there might be a Holocaust was the
No,
name of
it's
the Cold
preventing
War.
another world war. It was not very little to do.
Well,
I
as
mean,
you've
lots
discussed,
of historians have wrote
in the
about this.
1990s, pop culture became obsessed with the Holocaust and World War II.
Yes, in the 1990s, it's true. So
Well,
Americans tell
1989 to
themselves.
2016 or something is the unipolar moment in which we were on top and fucked up in a lot of ways. But what about United Nations? So there is a
You
global
mean the
body.
Security Council determines everything, and it was created, absolutely no question, to be the velvet glove over the iron fist of American hegemony? I mean, this is just the
Okay,
argument.
so you
I mean,
so
this is just the facts. I mean, it's not even an argument. It's just
as
they
I said,
say this
I'm a
literally.
disciple of Robert Wright. He's a big fan of international law, and
See
he
how
did
that worked out.
so his argument against the Iraq War was both that it was misguided and a disaster, but that it violated the Security Council. It was illegal under international law. So you do not see international law as a future, some sort of
Maybe.
hegemonic future system.
Certainly not. I don't think there. I don't think you're going to have an effective international law with American hegemon.
But you're saying
I would like the
America is no
idea.
longer the hegemon. So how can it? So
No.
what sort of system replaces that?
I said America. No, I didn't say America is the hegemon. And the American century being over, it doesn't mean America isn't the hegemon anymore. America is still clearly more powerful than everyone on Earth, and it doesn't actually require that many people to run the world. With new technologies like drones, and plus the longstanding nuclear weapons issues. No, so America's still the hegemon, even if the American century itself is over. That sort
Okay.
of pure domination is over.
So what role do you see the United Nations or international law playing in the future? Obviously, America doesn't respect it, nor does
Power will
Russia.
matter. Yeah, power matters more. I mean, in peripheral cases on the margins, I'm sure it will have good effects. But yeah, I mean, ultimately in IR at this moment, power matters more. That's what I think.
Okay, I assume as you were writing this, or at least conceiving this article, Russia invaded Ukraine. Did that change the article at all, or change how you think about this?
No, I pitched it afterward. I don't think that's a big moment in structural geopolitics. I mean, I think it's terrible what Putin has done, and everything say around that. I mean, it's brutal and it's horrible, and he did it for a diversity of reasons, all of which are not things that I support. But it doesn't augur any huge structural shift in international relations.
Talk more about that.
I mean, in what way?
Well,
I've said it all. Putin invading a neighbor
well,
is
it seems
just not
it's.
restructuring
So you think
the global power.
this is a sideshow of
I mean, it's not a sideshow for the people in Ukraine, but I don't think that it's going to change the
doesn't
larger
doesn't it
structures.
show how that Russia,
Did Iraq?
which we considered like a declining great power, was more like a middle power or something because it couldn't assert its will over a much smaller and weaker neighbor?
I mean, to be decided with that. I think we'll see about that. But I mean, I think Russia is still a declining power, and I think still the main theater of IR will be U.S. China. I don't see how Ukraine changes that. Basically, it's horrible, and there's brutal crimes being
Do
committed
you
there.
think it? Okay, invading another country is something that leaders seem
America
to
loves
enjoy doing
doing.
a lot, um, and it almost never works. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine seems to be another instance of that, where a leader decides it'll be a good idea if I invade another country, and it's not a good idea. Does that make China think any differently about anything? Does it make America think any differently about
I don't
anything?
think China was on the verge of invading other countries. I think China likes having an unstable periphery, which provides a logic for its domestic military industrial complex. But I don't think China was going to like invade South Korea or Japan or the Philippines or Australia or Indonesia. And I think in the United States, there's not really taste for invasion post Iraq and Afghanistan right now.
So how is power being thrown around?
What do you mean?
Invasion and occupation.
Oh, right now. Oh, so it's
Or in the foreseeable future.
in
Invasion and
international
occupation
institutions.
has there's a bad taste about it, given the events of the past 20 years.
Well, China might do something with Taiwan. I mean, I don't think that's off the table. And I don't think that the United States is going to fight World War III over Taiwan. So my worry is that American policymakers will not do anything, and then there'll be some dramatic move made by China. And then instead of doing what they should have done in fostering a years-long security transition so that American allies and friends in the region would be able to defend themselves or would be able to work international relations to their liking, America will just more likely, I think, cut and run because people are unable to give up the fantasy of American domination of East Asia, which I think is impossible. Doesn't mean America's not the hegemon if they can't dominate every region of the world at all moments, but I don't see how the fantasy of domination in East Asia will ever be achieved. I think that's a chimera.
What is your greatest fear about this period we're entering into, where the facts are shifting? What are you most worried about?
Americans not realizing that the world has changed and clinging on to their fantasy of hegemony, which will spur more wars, that will continue to spur defense spending, that we will continue to consume an incredible amount and continue to destroy the environment. So those are my biggest fears. Also, climate is going to engender a lot of population movements that are going to result in terrible loss of life and deracination. I would like for the United States to embrace a wide refugee policy. I don't see that happening. So I think that the fantasy of American empire is going to continue.
So, do you think that America will want to launch a war for Taiwan or something, and that will be a total disaster for everyone? Or do you
It's
think
tough to
that's
know. It's tough to know, but I definitely think that China has made clear that it considers Taiwan part of its territory, and as they get stronger and stronger, it seems, if not inevitable, a real possibility that something like that will happen. And I don't think that we should exchange nuclear weapons over that.
I would agree with that. I mean, if you look at how China has like dealt with Hong Kong over the past couple of years, and that there hasn't. I mean, it's coincided with the pandemic, so people were occupied otherwise, but like they've done it, and there hasn't. We're not boycotting. No one seems to really care that much about Hong Kong. So then
Right.
you wonder how much people will care about Taiwan.
Right. A cross-strait invasion is different, but yeah, I mean, I just don't. I don't think Americans are going to fight a World War III over it. And if that's the reality, then our policy should be different.
Can you talk about the restrainer school of thought or movement, or however you would characterize it, and
Sure. I
what
mean,
that
broadly speaking,
what that school would advise us to pay attention to?
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the movement really grew out of the idea, and there's was broad agreement across the political spectrum that the United States should really not be as involved in the Middle East as it has been. The American interests in that region just aren't enough to be as involved as the country has been. But when it comes to China, I think there's a lot of disagreements within the community, with people on the left being generally skeptical about "quote unquote" confronting China, realists being more serious or more interested, not more serious, more interested in confronting China and remaining dominant in East Asia. And then you have, people on the right, libertarians, falling in different camps at different moments. And then there's disagreements about global political economy, with socialists being less into a deregulated political economy and libertarians being more into it. So I think there are significant divisions within the restrainer group.
Okay, as a layperson with no expertise in anything, it seems to me that China does not have global ambitions, does not have ideological ambitions, really. It seems like they want to grow more powerful, make
In its
money,
region, yeah.
bring
Yeah.
bring the I mean they've basically done this, bring, the peasantry like into a modern economy. And like, so I guess there's something called like Xi Jinping thought or something that he's trying to promulgate, but people in like universities in other countries are not reading his thought. Like, it doesn't seem like there's an animating idea in the way that the struggles of the 19th century involved ideas.
Yeah,
How does that strike you?
yeah, I broadly agree, and I wrote that in the article.
Okay, we had to take a brief break, but we're back at it. Let me ask you
Better than
about
ever.
yeah, revivified. Do you see the 25 or 50 years from now, is there going to be more like a 19th century sort of spheres of influence,
No,
balance of
that's not
power?
possible anymore, really. The economies are, well, given the current outlook, it's not possible. There could be catastrophe, climate, a meteor could hit, a truly, Black Death-esque pandemic could happen, and then all bets are off. But, given current projections, I think it's very difficult to see a return to the 19th century balance of power politics. Nuclear weapons really do change things. They make risks of miscalculation, world ending, and also just the economies are just, capitalism is truly global now. It has touched everywhere on Earth. And it's just not possible really to put that genie back in the bottle, as it were.
Hmm.
So I think that it's very difficult to imagine a return to the 19th century.
Okay, and you're not optimistic about international law or the United Nations assuming more of a role as
Not with American hegemony. I mean, I think the UN particularly is so tainted at this point that it would have to be a new institution that could, do the good things of the UN without being tainted by association with it. But I mean, international law, it's always a possibility. I think you'd have to see great powers give up real elements of their sovereignty, which hasn't happened. It's unlikely to happen, but it's not impossible.
yeah, I am not optimistic about that happening in
I
in the near future.
no, but you never know.
How did Okay, different question. How did the pandemic change your view of international relations at all? Were there things about how countries reacted to the pandemic that surprised you?
Not really. I mean, America was terrible with it. Um, Not unpredictable given the hollowing out of the state by the liberals you love so much, Arya. But
Let's
no.
not throw any accusations like that around. Well,
uh,
if you
I mean, all about
was
the
it
state in
predictable or not?
the 80s and 90s. What are you going to do?
Famously, there was like some organization, I don't think it was the WHO, but something rated all the countries in like 2019 on capability of dealing with the pandemic, and they rated America as having the best capability. So
What a shock.
so
What a
that was
shock.
that did not happen. I mean, something that it the pandemic was an external threat, but passed biologically from person to person. But it wasn't personalized in the way that most conventional threats are. So it's somewhat akin to climate change in that there's not a person you can get angry at or try to kill or capture or something to end this. And it's disappointing that something that seemingly threatened every person and nation on Earth led to further division and blaming various groups. It's sort of like the thing from Watchmen, the comic book about the alien invasion would unite the various countries and nations on Earth to fight against the aliens. We had something sort of like that, and it didn't unite the countries on Earth. Like, people are more divided than they were before. Was I being a
Yeah, I mean, in an
Pollyanna
era of
or?
nation states, that's, I guess, not, particularly in an era of nation states when you're not facing like a literal alien that would kill you in a minute. It's not especially surprising what happened. But yeah, I guess it's not that surprising.
It just seems like there's something in, well, you reject the idea of innate human psychology or nature, but it's harder to mobilize people against something abstract than against another person or group. And
Sure,
the
broadly
virus is not as
speaking, sure.
abstract as climate change, which is like a complicated process. The virus are these microscopic things, but yeah, we
Yeah,
really
but
fucked it up.
it affects the old and the indigent the most, which are the people who are not on Twitter or in power, even though we have a gerontocracy.
Well, that is one of,
But
I mean, something that was somewhat surprising is, yeah, we do have a gerontocracy. The Speaker of the House is 80, the president is 77 or whatever. And, it was traditionally understood that the GOP was sort of the party of, representing the interests of old people. And they were sort of like, including President Trump himself, who was the
yeah, but there's
oldest
so
at
much
the time.
culture war. I mean, like the culture war, because there's no real politics anymore. Everything is culture war, and it became a culture war issue very quickly, and that's more important, clearly, with
Right.
people's identity and how they view politics, what have you. Culture war is more important. It's the only way people feel like they can express political, really anything.
Okay, that makes sense. And yet, this was a literal life or death threat to a certain group of people who are traditionally understood to have more power
Yeah,
because
and
they
they
vote
chose
more
culture
often
war,
and they
you
have
know?
accumulated wealth and so forth, but their interests were pushed aside mostly for the interests of larger groups of
Not if
people.
their interest is to fight a culture war.
Well, I mean, there are people who would rather fight a culture war and die of a virus than not die of a virus, I guess. And that's, I don't know, the American Berserk or something. Um, let's see. Do you worry that there's the blob or whatever you want to call it, like sort of wants, if we could say they have a coherent desire, like some sort of conflict with China? So, because this is like something they understand.
I think they want to have the appearance of a conflict with China without a military or economic war, basically, because you need to justify this brutal military machine, to say nothing of justifying their own jobs within the structure. But I don't think most people want to have like a real war
Okay, so
or a
so
real
like a
economic or
Cold War,
military
and
war. But not even a Cold War, because during the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union didn't trade with each other. You can't have that right now.
right. So that is novel in the
Yeah,
situation, or is
it
that
makes
the
it
economies
totally
are so
different.
intertwined
Yeah,
and
it makes
they
it
make
almost
all of our
uncomparable.
crap and we pay them to buy that crap. And so it would seemingly be in both of our interests not to start a war with each other because then we would stop buying crap from them and they would, not get money for their
Well,
to
I
pay
think it's
people.
more than that. It's both regimes' legitimacy depend on that relationship. America to consume, and China, you need to have that export market to support this emergent middle class. So it's more than just like that. It's like the government's reason for being is dependent upon continuing this.
Right. And yeah, if the Chinese economy slows down or reverses or something, then maybe President Xi doesn't become president for life.
Right. I mean, that's a concern. That's the concern.
Let's see. You mentioned in the piece the historicist approach of restrainers.
Yeah.
What is, can you define that, and how is that
Yeah,
different
just
from?
looking at what has actually happened as opposed to what in theory has happened. Looking at what states actually do, them relying on theories of human nature or international relations, or like saying states naturally expand or human beings naturally do X, actually taking a more historical, empirical, and I think sophisticated view of the complexity of international relations and state action. Like Mersheimer, right? Mersheimer says China is going to expand because that's what states do. I don't think so. I disagree with that's an ontological claim about what states capital I, excuse me, capital A are in the world. That don't think hold. I don't think that holds.
Right. Okay. So, political science has science in the word or in the phrase, but this is not physics. And humans act in much more unpredictable ways than, atoms and so forth.
Yep.
Does the historicist make predictions less often than the theorist because a theorist has like a model or something, and the
Well,
historicist.
IR theorists usually don't make predictions because I mean they're not unsophisticated. I think they appreciate the limits of their actions. I mean, I mean everyone kind of talks in predictions because you have to have a theory of the future in order to make sense of the present. But yeah, I mean it's ultimately I would say reducible to judgment and wisdom as opposed to any sort of model or prediction or equation.
Okay, so
I mean, in political scientists' more arrogant moments, people did claim like they could predict things, but I think that's not the world we live in today. It might have been the world we lived in the 90s, but it's really not what people think today.
okay, how do you think American culture will change as America declines relative to other powers?
I mean, this is a tough issue because unlike other times in history, you don't actually need that many people to run a globe-spanning empire. If you think about the British or the Romans, you actually need people to go out and do things. So you don't really need that anymore. So you could actually have like American decline with this globe-spanning, extraordinarily powerful empire, which is why the American century being over doesn't necessarily people I think misinterpret it as me saying America is no longer a hegemon. It's not true. You could have the hegemony without the ideological project behind it. We haven't had a draft in 50 years. I mean, you just don't need that many people to run this thing.
Right. But how do you see, like America, the self-conception of the American
Probably
people?
continuing because we get the best of both worlds. We get to pretend we're valorous warriors without actually doing anything. We get to have football flyovers and
Mhm.
watch Zero Dark 30 without actually having any risk. It's kind of nice. You get to have that sort of what is it, jouissance of empire without the risk.
Okay, the thrill up the leg. Yeah. Are you familiar with Ross Douthat's like decadent culture thesis?
Yeah, he's wrong. Decadence is a ridiculous category. What
Oh,
does that mean? Who's decadence?
okay, well, you think that it doesn't make sense to talk about decadence at all, or you think he's the
Yeah, well, I
things
mean,
he?
what's he talking about? Sex and drugs, right? That's what
No, I think
he's a
it's more
conservative
sort of like
Catholic.
the culture is stagnant in general, and he uses
According to whom?
examples.
The culture is not stagnant. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's
Well,
never
he
true.
goes from popular culture where every movie is a reboot or intellectual property that was invented,
That's
decades
not true.
ago,
I mean,
to
in
sort of like.
mass popular culture, sure, but I mean, there's plenty of interesting alternative cultures going. I mean, look at podcasting. It's an entirely new cultural form, entirely new. It's not stagnant.
That's true, but it's not new in the way that the internet was new. It's basically radio, except anyone can do it.
The radio is basically just telling stories. I mean, this is just scaling up, you know. The radio is just theater and telling stories. I mean, people are telling stories in new mediums in new interesting ways. I don't think decadence is a real category. It's part of this like conservative cyclical thing that I think is like pretty reactionary.
Well, explain that a little bit more.
Like Oswald Spengler, the decline of the West. It's basically having an organicist view of history where history runs in cycles, like rise, fall, death, rise. What would it be? Rise, efflorescence, decline, death. You know, it's just that just as like history doesn't always bend towards progress, it's not always cyclical either. It's part of that way philosophy of history ultimately that I just don't think is empirically shown in
Okay.
anything. Like civilizations don't have life cycles. That's not how it works. That's how we have you ever read like Hayden White's meta history? Like
No.
we as human beings apply narratives to these things,
Uh-huh.
but the narrative is not the reality. It's just a way for us to make sense of it. And that's what decadence
Okay,
is.
that
And we all do that to
that
some
makes sense to
degree.
me. There does seem to be a stagnancy in American culture in that, you know, Donald Trump, someone who first became famous in the early 1980s and has
But
been
that's
in
more
our
due to
conscious for
like
a
the
long time, became
peculiar
president. So many of the people who run the country are extremely old. It's like the baby boomer
but
rock
that's the nature of
musicians
American
are
politics.
still
You
huge
know, I mean,
stars. Like, did you see
that's
that
just
documentary about the Beatles? Like that was like the best
yeah.
thing, and that was from 1969 or something. Like
Yeah, but there are novel cultural forms. I mean, like there's tons of stuff on TikTok and new music by young people and Zoomers and all that stuff. It's just not true. There's just like a lot of cultural stuff. And like, yeah, the boomers have exert a significant amount on culture for like that's how the American power structure is organized. But you know, it doesn't mean that there's not other things happening. There's always other things happening.
Well, yeah, the longevity of the boomers is definitely part of this, and they are going to shuffle off at some point, especially faster and faster over the next couple of years. And yeah, it just seems like in some ways we're still living in that culture. There's been technological changes, of course, and
They just have the most money and are top of the power. But like, is Rolling Stone a vital magazine? No, no one thinks that.
but it's
You
still,
know,
like it still exists, and like we both know what it is.
sure,
Like
because we grew up in it. But I would say like a lot of that boomer art doesn't have a special vitality. I mean, even the MCU stuff, people are kind of getting tired of that. In 100 years, it's not going to be MCU. Things
we
are
we
things
can
are going to
hope,
change.
Although
I'm pretty confident on that
the
one.
corporations. When Mitt Romney said corporations are people, like the corporation lives forever. Like Disney is
Sure.
immortal,
IP is a thing. I mean, like, but the IP has always been a
and all the
thing. People
Marvel
told story
stuff.
about the gods.
All the Marvel stuff was invented in the early 1960s. So it's not like it's new in that the computer graphics are better or whatever. But like Spider-Man is like 80 years old or something, and people still love Spider-Man. I don't know.
And people love telling stories about Zeus. It's like there are particular cultural things that hit for whatever reason they keep on going, but that doesn't mean culture is stagnant. I don't think culture is
Okay.
never stagnant. It's just not. It's just not. It's not how things work. People saying culture is stagnant come from a particular view, usually older, usually conservative.
Okay. I'll have to think about this more. I mean, there are things that are new. Zoomers are doing dances on TikTok that I am not privy to or understand. But is this fundamentally new? I'm not sure. Okay.
Well, I mean, Ecclesiastes was saying nothing was fundamentally new quite a while ago.
Yeah, so nothing new under the sun. And I've had Kirby Ferguson, the documentarian, on, who his signature work is called Everything is a Remix. There's nothing truly new. Everything grows out of something pre-existing. But, since
There are degrees, sure, and I would say like at the highest level of mass culture, there's a lot of repetition. Yes.
and yeah, I don't know. And then Trump's appeal was a nostalgic appeal to the 1950s television,
I
sitcom,
mean,
Father Knows
kind of.
Best kind of
I don't
thing.
really think that's actually true. I think Trump's appeal was that he was mean and critical of the system. I don't think his appeal was really we're going to return to the 50s.
I don't know, make America great again. I mean, it's become, people call themselves
Yeah,
like MAGA
but that's
now.
like a vicious thing. I mean, yeah, it great again, and sure, there's like this imagined notion, but I don't think Trump's really. No one thought we're going back to the 50s. Trump's appeal was he was mean and he was throwing a bomb at the system.
I mean, for some people, his outsiderness, his fuck you attitude was part of the appeal. Um, okay, is there anything else from the essay that we haven't touched on that you think deserves discussion?
No, I think we talked a lot about it.
Okay,
Thank you for
so
having me on.
well, thanks for coming on. And I think the last time you were on, you had not yet debuted your podcast. So can
Oh,
you
yeah,
talk about what that is
everyone.
and plug it?
Sure. Everyone subscribe to American Prestige. It's on Substack. It's a foreign affairs show. We usually give one free interview a week, and we do a news update every Friday, and then we have another bonus, and then we give a bonus, and the bonuses are usually these long series. We did a long series on Vietnam, I think like 8 episodes. I think it's going to be ultimately a 10-episode series on Afghanistan. We do more fun ones, like this week we had one on Eurovision. So everyone check that out.
And is there a log line to the podcast?
What It's about the United States and the friends it's made along the way.
Maybe, yeah, maybe American history really is like it was inside of us all along.
Yes, in
Okay.
the smile of every baby, in the blooming of every flower.
And you are on Twitter, and how can people follow you on Twitter if they want to do that?
Uh, D. Bessner,
Okay,
my
and
name.
I am ARYHCW. People can rate and review and do other things like that if they so desire. Okay, thank you, Daniel, for a lively discussion, and thank you to all of our listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks, Aryeh.